Okay, looks like we're at starting time. Sneaks up on you, doesn't it? Switch over. I'm not much on PowerPoints. You guys know by now this is not going to be a typical Tech Ed session, right? Okay, just as long as you know that, because there's like 8 other tracks going on. And if you think this touchy-feely stuff is bad, you need to be going to one of them. So the first topic I want to talk about in the area of why you should be here and pay attention to me is a little bit about evolution. Because I find evolution to be a very good tool for helping me understand why the world works the way it does. And it's simple at its most basic concept. Survival of the fittest. You have ecosystems, environments, things that fit them survive, things that don't move away or die off. Well, that's not just the natural world. The .NET universe is an environment, an ecosystem. One would hope that you are kind of the cream. Certainly, at worst, you are the survivors of 10 years of the .NET ecosystem, which is, what's the big thing about it that's most notable? It's become more and more complex. It started out complex, it got worse. How did you survive then? What is survival of the fittest in .NET? It's people that know how to handle complexity, complex APIs, complex object models. You write lots and lots of code. Some of you have probably heard me talk before about how some of you are addicted to writing code, in fact. You're code heads, kind of like cokeheads, just one letter off and do a few lines to get your kicks. So that's fine. You are adapted to this environment, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, the thing about it is, environments change. These guys were adapted to an environment once. A lush, swampy world. They dominated the earth for millions of years until the environment changed. And when that environment changed, they pretty much wiped out. And they were replaced by those small scurrying mammals that they probably made fun of before the comet came. Okay, well, the thing about it is, our ecosystem, no ecosystem is expected to stay the same for a long time. I'll tell you an example of one from, I live in Nashville, Tennessee. So I understand a lot about the music business. I have friends in the business. I have clients in the music business. And they were doing just fine in an environment in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then their environment changed. The asteroid that hit their world was this. And all of a sudden, their adaptations to selling physical product didn't do them any good, and they've mostly died out in a pretty short period of time. And that's the consequences that you can see sometimes of changing environments. Environments always change. Now, I would say that we should expect that this little device here didn't just change the music industry, it's kind of multiplied, and it's had descendants, iPhone and iPad and things like that. We are in a world now where user expectations are changing because a lot of young folks come up in the business world, their entire expectation of what things are supposed to look and act like is based on touch phones and various other devices that are quite a bit beyond the sort of things that we have been doing in this .NET ecosystem. All right, this is my teleprompter. Touch-based, right? I can just flick through my notes here as I talk to you. All touch-based. You can attach a keyboard to it, but I can guarantee you won't like the experience much. I didn't. How many of you have written an application at this point in your career that was primarily intended for a touch-based user interface? That's about 20%. Well then, how many of you want to connect with your Xbox? Do you expect that eventually we will get gestures into our applications in some cases? How many of you have written a business application that was based on gestures? Oh gosh, that would be zero, wouldn't it? Because they haven't put it out yet. But we're in a time during which our environment is pretty rapidly changing. So then if the environment changes, well then how do you deal with that? I mean, unlike dinosaurs, we are kind of intelligent creatures. We can look at the future, maybe prepare for it. So let's look at our future and kind of see if we can understand what do we need to do in order to get ready for it. What do we need to do in order to change? And in order to do that, let me talk to you a little bit about a trend that I see based on my own experience and what it might suggest. In 1978, I worked in Nashville as a consultant for a temporary staffing agency and actually produced an application. It replaced their cards, their index cards, and paper files, which was a huge advance to them at the time, even though it looked like this. Now, that was 1978. Coincidentally, I wrote another application precisely 30 years later, aimed at exactly the same environment. And this is kind of the difference between the two. Let me very quickly go over and show you the other one briefly. I've demoed it a few times, so I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it. How many of you have seen me do StaffLinks demoed at one time or another? And how many have never seen it? Oh gosh. All right, then I'll spend more than 2 minutes on it then, and beg the indulgence of those of you who might have seen it. Oh, I've got to get my desktop background right. You see, I had Master Chief in a different desktop background. I wrote a WPF program that lets him be, because he fits in almost every background. But he looks particularly good in this one. I really like him in this one. So you can move him around and resize him if you need to let him fit wherever environment you want him in. I wrote a touch-based version of him too. Move him around with your finger on a touch-based system. Where was I? Oh yeah. Let's get rid of Master Chief and talk about this application right here, which was for temporary staffing. It's a real application. The data's pretty old because I haven't updated sample data in a long, long time. But the password expired. I had to change my password when I logged on this morning. I changed it to TechEd 2011, so maybe I can remember it going forward. Basically, it has a dashboard for people that work for temporary staffing agencies with areas for the owner to find out things about the business. If you don't want to see that, well, you slip that up out of the way. If you do want to see stuff there, everything there is clickable, so you can see the details that go with that particular statistic. Always get back to the dashboard like that. There are things that you might need to do, action items. The system figures those out for you. It navigates not just to the record, but down to the individual screen that is concerned with that particular action item. By the way, you don't have to take pictures of this. There's videos of this on the web if you want to show this to coworkers or whatever. The job board, of course, is the usual sort of sorting kind of capabilities you might expect. The editing function, all of the major entities have screens where you can search for and find individual records. And in this particular case, these records all happen to be part of the same organization. We have the ability to do a hierarchy there, so we can, zoom that, take a look at it, and if the hierarchy is really big, like the staffing organization itself, that zooming capability and that collapsing capability turns out to be quite a bit more important, right? And that's a good usability thing, right? Because users don't really get the whole drop-down things for department and branch and such. This tends to work out better. We've also got mapping capability, so you can actually see where all these are. If I've got a good connection, did I plug in the internet on this one? I didn't plug in the internet. Well, that would probably explain why I'm not getting anything. It's yeah, the bandwidth goes down quite a bit actually. Let's give that another chance. Oh, you still don't like it, do you? Oh, there it is. Yeah. Those happen to be things around my house in Nashville, just sample addresses. So we've got the usual sort of zooming capability, the virtual Earth, and things like that. So you can edit particular records, of course. The editing screen looks about like this with the usual kind of subscreens. If you're editing child records, for instance, we got lots of addresses, then basically the front shrinks back a little bit and the foreground pops out. We keep up with whether or not people have made changes, and when they've reversed those, show you that one more time. Edit that and pops in like that. But you can actually be in the middle of something, and you think that's a modal screen, but no, that's not good usability. So you might need, somebody might walk in the door, and you actually need to go over to talk to that employee. So you bring up Anna's record, work with her for a while, and then go back to where you were. It just picks up where you left off, basically. This is all written in WPF, but you can do it all in Silverlight, except the reflections. People tend to like this over here. We knew we needed notes. We didn't, but not very often. So we just kind of, whoops, I can't spell. Editable notes, right? And they shrink back out of the way when you don't need them anymore. You really don't want to see them anymore. They take off the sticky flag, except that you can bring it back if you need to. Right. So that's kind of the editing experience. You go over to employees and see a couple of odd things there. You find out that, let's say the hiring steps, we keep up with color-coded stuff. When things are completed, we turn them green. The skills, something, maybe she's also a pipe welder. She's a journeyman level for that. She's a talented lady, isn't she? Assignments, what assignments has she had? Oh, I guess I should mention this, that we've got quite a bit of hover capability, that if you hover, you get information about somebody's skills and recent activity and jobs they've been on and things like that. And let's see, go back to Jen, to Anna. Also, we make sure that if you want to see the picture bigger, we'll do that. We'll also put the button there, because you don't remove pictures very often, do you? How many times would you expect people to do that? But if they did, you don't want them hunting around in menus looking for the button. So just kind of tuck it up there out of the way when it's not needed. Availability, we've got a little drag and drop kind of thing for that, so that the test data has people available 24 hours a day. There are companies like that, aren't there? Any Microsoft workers in here? Maybe you don't want to work on Sunday, and maybe on Thursday you need to go home a little early. You can also change it over here, it's fine. It's all kind of synced up. So that's kind of a very quick overview of how different something can be done, and I think it's an interesting comparison to look at that versus what we did in 1978, to see how far we've come. That's kind of two ends of a trend line. Well, producing that application was something that didn't come particularly naturally or obviously to somebody who came up in the .NET ecosystem. We had to learn a lot. We had to kind of reorient our brains about some things, how we prototype and how we work with users to figure things out. But one of the more important things that we learned as we went through this, and that I've gotten to the point I really like to talk about because most developers haven't thought much about it, is design principles at a fundamental level. You see, the world of design has been evolving for centuries. There are a lot of great design principles out there that we can take advantage of as we make our journey into this radically changing environment that we have to adapt to. Lots of these principles, but in the past, we've only looked at a few of them because our user interface technologies didn't give us enough flexibility to use many of those design principles very well. We just kind of cookie-cuttered our designs based on stuff we saw in other places. And now, our degrees of freedom are much bigger, our user expectations are bigger. So if you're going to do well in this environment, then it behooves you to understand a little bit about those design principles. Because I think that they'll be helpful for those of you who are going forward into this world. You don't have to, of course. I would hope that all of you are here because you saw the title and thought, okay, this sounds pretty good. Maybe I want to know about this. But no doubt you have people on your teams who think, man, code. They're code addicts. They can't help it. They want to be in their cubicle writing code like all of the time. In fact, when you talk to them about design, they want to talk about test-driven design. What does that mean? That means you write code to do your design. Okay, and I'm sure that there's plumbing kind of things where that's a perfectly appropriate approach, but I don't think it works particularly well in this world. So, I don't know how many of them are wanting to come forward, but the thing about it is, they might do okay, because when we had that big asteroid came, these guys here didn't all die off. That's what scientists say. Scientists say that some of them turned into this. So, they might make minor adaptations and still kind of walk the same way, but they won't quite have the power, I think, that maybe they used to have. So, I think a lot of us, even if we're kind of inclined to understand and embrace this world, probably aren't very ready for it. And that's kind of what I want to spend the balance of the time talking about today. Because of that survival of the fittest in the .NET world, you got here by writing complex code. You didn't get here by designing intuitive interfaces or understanding design principles for the most part. In fact, you generally spend about 8 hours a day, most of you, writing code. 7 at least. Do you realize what that does to your brain? And I don't mean that in a flip way, okay? Your brain is very plastic. It's very adaptable. It learns what you throw at it. It adapts to what you throw at it. So you spend that many hours a day writing code in your cubicle, it wires your brain a certain way to do that effectively. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's going to be a necessary part of our industry for a long time. But what it means is you spend most of your time working out one side of your brain, that logical, procedural, detailed side. And you don't really spend too much time on the other side of your brain that's a little bit more about intuition and big picture thinking and sort of getting inside other people's minds. You just don't train your brain up as much there as I'd like to think most people need to in order to live in this world. And it's as if, think about a metaphor in the physical world that you went to the gym. I'm right-handed. How many of you are right-handed? Probably 90%, right? Okay, so you go to the gym, and you're right-handed, and you say, well, my right hand works best, therefore I'm just going to ignore my left arm. Let's work out in the gym 3 hours a day with just my right arm. What will you look like at the end of 6 months or a year? This is powerful here, but just an atrophied arm there because you didn't work it out. It's not that your left arm is not good for some things, and there are certainly tasks where you need them both, right? But if you don't work it out, it doesn't develop any strength. It doesn't develop any capability. And it's the same way with your brain. If you don't work the right side of your brain out, then it doesn't develop capability. Now, a lot of people think, oh gosh, my right brain really isn't working. Well, unless you have severe Asperger's syndrome or something, it does. It's just that you don't train it. And I can prove to you that it works for the most part. So let's do a little thing here to kind of show that your right brain is working just fine, at least with hopefully most of you. I cook breakfast most days. I'm the cook in my house. And my most common thing that I cook is bacon and eggs, right? And I'm cooking the bacon. I get the eggs out, put them beside the pan to kind of be ready when the bacon's done. One day I thought, what? Those eggs, if I could get inside their mind, how would they feel about this whole situation? So basically, I took this picture. Okay, now you laughed at that. Most of you. It's mildly funny, at least. Do you think that there is something in your procedural left brain that went through the following process? There are 2 eggs. They are beside a hot pan. They look scared. Ha, ha, ha. No. Humor is basically a right brain thing, big picture thing. If you have a sense of humor, your right brain works. All you need to do is tune it up. And one of the things that you can do to do that most effectively is to understand the whole world of design and a little bit about some of the principles that you need to know in order to get there. Now, because the basic idea that I want you to get to is that you learn to kind of look at the world with some new eyes. How many of you were in my session last year? Check it. How many of you were not here last year? Okay, so you haven't seen this picture. Those of you who saw this picture last year, just be quiet. I took it at Tech Ed last year in the elevator across the street from the convention center. This is the elevator button panel. And I noticed something about it that made me want to take a picture. And you can envision me, with my camera down on my knees taking the picture and the people getting on the elevator going. I probably thought I was a terrorist or something trying to figure out how to sabotage the elevator. So I took this picture. And what I want you to do when I show it to you is I want you to look at it for a few seconds and see if you see anything about it that's notable, that you might comment on if somebody got in the elevator with you. Okay? And when you see something, please raise your hand. And I'm going to hold it up until most of the room raises your hand. Okay? So you better work with me on this. We may just sit here for the next 45 minutes doing nothing. Okay? So here's the elevator panel. Oops, sorry. Keep those hands up, please, because I got to see when the room's reached a sort of critical mass state. All right, you've done pretty well. I need a volunteer to tell me what you saw. No 13. Hey, what? Yeah, no 1, 2, but no 13 is by far the most common answer I will get from software developers. And it is notable. A lot of hotels don't have 13s, especially in cities with casinos. They don't want a 13th floor. People don't want to stay there. So, no 13th floor. Absolutely correct, absolutely true, notable, and interesting. Did anybody spot anything else besides the numbering scheme that stood out to you right here? The buttons have numbers. The buttons don't have numbers. Anything related to that? Yeah? That's why I took the picture. The G has paint smeared off of it. Why? People think it's a button. I wonder how many people get on the elevator every day and hurt their finger pushing that thing. Why do they think it's a button? There's all kinds of reasons they think it's a button. One reason is that it's round, and buttons have been round for centuries. So that is a design principle called archetypes. The archetype of a button is round. Only in the computer world are buttons rectangular. In the rest of the world, buttons are round. So they see it, they punch at it. They punch the metal placard. Now, that's bad design. And as you move into the design world, you begin to notice things like that quite a lot more. One of the interesting exercises I do in my design class, and you don't need me to do this, okay, is that I teach a class in various places. In one place, I teach in Oslo, Norway, at the old airport building, because they have a new one, and my training partner is there. I send the students out to look for examples of good and bad design. And inevitably, people will come back. They take pictures with their cell phone, email them to me, and then we discuss it in class. But they always find something. And you'll hear people go, I've walked by that thing 100 times and never really noticed that it's good design or bad design. So one of the things to turn your right brain on and tune it up is to be more aware of what's going on in your world. Look, things don't have to be this way. This is the elevator in Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas. There are several interesting things about this elevator. One in particular is it's the only elevator in a luxury hotel that I've ever gotten in that the advertising video screen plays ads for a tattoo parlor down in the lobby. But more to the point, this is good design. People don't press the placards here because the placards have a shape that suggests that they are an adornment to the button. The button is round, the way it should be, and fits in a slot in the placard. And this is even a more efficient design to manufacture because you got less wastage of the metal. So bad design doesn't have to be there. We've got lots of possibilities for good design, but we won't even spot when bad design is, well, first of all, one thing that you do use to spot bad design is when you get frustrated with something because it's hard to figure out. That's almost always due to bad design. I tell people, it's the old, this is my adaptation of Asimov's principle. He used to talk about reading things, and he said, if I read something and I couldn't understand what the guy was trying to say, I didn't assume I was stupid. I assumed he didn't know how to write, or he didn't understand it himself. The same thing is true if I go out and use something in the modern world. I don't assume I'm stupid if I have trouble with it. I assume the person designing it didn't know how to do it right. That's particularly true of software, and boy, I see that one all the time. And you're thinking, okay, fine. So we look at designs in the real world. Oh, another notable thing about this, notice that the most important buttons are bigger. Did you notice that? Help people find the buttons easier? You think these ideas don't apply to software? Let me tell you about being in Chicago at a conference last fall in which I looked at 10 software packages for a particular medical application space, as I was consulting with somebody in that space. And I saw out of 8 of the 10 a screen that more or less looked like this. It had a big array of identically sized rectangular buttons with completely random icons on them, as far as I could tell. This is your entry into design principles. Let's look at this and try to understand what design principles are being violated here. That's all right. I'll go through them. I got a slide for them. You've probably spotted. Which one you spot? No, what's the sucker that stands? What's the what? The demon. Oh, it's just a random icon I had on my disk. It's used as the humor page on my website, which, by the way, billyhollis.com will redirect you there, and you can get stuff there, etc. Where was I? Oh, yes. So what design principles does this violate? Well, first of all, let's just look at 3 to kind of begin to introduce you to some of the most important design principles that software developers need to understand. First, there's something called the Pareto principle. You've probably even heard of that one, the 80-20 rule. Basically, we can pretty much be assured that the user uses 20% of these buttons 80% of the time. That's generally true of most systems. It's true in a lot of things in life. 20% of your users give you 80% of your grief, don't they? Isn't that about right? 20% of your customers probably furnish you with 80% of your value and profit in business. So that rule seems to be active all over the place, and it's certainly active here. We don't need to see all these buttons all the time because some of them aren't needed very much. Okay. Fine. What would we do about that? Gosh, that one's so obvious even the Windows team figured it out. You have an advanced section that people don't have to look at all the time. What else? Well, there's Fitts Law. Yet another reason why we don't want all these buttons. The amount of time to locate and use an option is smaller if the option is bigger. That's what the elevator is exhibiting. People can get to the restaurant button fast because it's big. There is no law, as far as I know, Congress has never passed one, that requires all the buttons on your user interfaces to be the same size. I'm pretty sure that law has not been implemented yet, and yet we do it anyway. We end up with all these identically sized buttons. Well, part of the reason is we don't have much room, because we got too many bloody buttons. So that gets us down to Hick's law. The amount of time required to locate and use an option is larger if the user must choose from many options. Now that sounds fairly obvious. I've got research to back this one up. And in a sense, I guess you'd say it is obvious, but people seem to ignore it all the time. I mean, if a user comes to you, or the manager of the users, and says, please implement this feature for me. Well, you survivors in the .NET ecosystem probably survived by saying, sure, another feature, great, I'll go back to my cubicle and start writing code for that right away. And you did it, you finished the thing, and now it's got to go on the UI so they can get to it somewhere. And what do? You throw another option on a menu or another button in a panel or something. You just throw it on there because you don't know what else to do. Your job was to code the function and make it work. Well, did you ever think about the fact that every time you add a new feature to a user interface like that, you make the other features less valuable because they become harder to find and use? You hurt the user's productivity every time you do it. Now, we have traditionally been able to get away with that because we have come up, and I don't just mean the .NET era, pretty much from the beginning of the computer world. I mean, look, let's go back to here. People love that thing, even though you think it's hideously ugly. Why? Because it made something possible that wasn't possible before. For most of our careers, it's been enough just to make something possible. But I believe our ecosystem, our environment is changing, and we have a certain set of users and a certain set of circumstances in which making it possible isn't good enough anymore. We have to actually make it easy. There's value in that. Now, as I said, there are people who kind of don't want to go there, and they won't. But that leaves even more value for the people who do go there. So that's three big design principles that as you're designing user interfaces, you need to internalize. You ought to get to the point where when you get too much clutter on a system, you just kind of feel uncomfortable about that. It doesn't feel right. See, that's one of the problems with design principles, though, is that they're just guidelines. And there's a certain amount of intuition to this right brain stuff. There isn't any rule that says, put no more than 4 options, or put no more than 5, or put no more than 6. There's no such rule. It varies with circumstances. It varies with the nature of the application. But there is a general principle that says, don't put too many. You make it too hard for people to find the ones they need and to learn the application. There's a famous story about this. For a couple of generations of Microsoft Office, they maintained their list of most requested features, 10 most requested features. For 2 years running, the 10 most requested features on the list were already in the product. But people couldn't find them. The worst thing to me about the ribbon in Office today is I can't find things. I don't know where to look. It needs some kind of generic search function or something. And I'm sure it's probably okay for people who sort of take the natural route to using the system. I'm a little whacked, and I tend to use things a little more in depth than other people. Let's see. There are quite a lot of design principles, and in fact, I want to mention right now, because I'll be talking about this in the end. If this is an area that you like the idea of, this is probably the best place to start that I know of. Anybody own this book, Universal Principles of Design? Has nothing to do with software. What it does is take about 125 design principles. This is the old version because I got it a while back. The new one has 25 more in it. Every design principle has one page of explanation and one page of examples. If you go to my website under resources, you'll see an Amazon link for this thing. So, now, one design principle of writing is, you ever heard the Mark Twain quip? I'm writing you a long letter because I don't have time to write you a short one. If you're a writer, you understand that. It took a lot of time for them to craft the most important things to know about a design principle in one page. But what that assures you is you don't get any fluff. You get exactly what you need to know, and you see tangible examples. But I'm going to warn you, if you get this book, don't try to read it all at one sitting. You'll overload the right side of your brain. It's like going out and working out with your atrophied right arm too much. It'll be sore. It won't feel good. Do 10 or 12 at a time. Give your brain a little chance to recuperate. So there are lots and lots of design principles, and there are some interesting groupings of them. And I thought I would just kind of show you a few of them to give you a little feel for the whole space that's involved. For example, let's see if I can find the whole. We kind of understand a little bit about the idea of white space, don't we? In the sense that we understand that, well, if we go over to the staff links, I'll kind of go to a screen there. Part of the reason that this tends to look good to people is that because he uses white space pretty good. Those things over there on the side are tabs. That's a tab controlling the screens. But we ripped every bit of the tab rectangular cosmetic stuff out. And we went to right justified labels, not left justified labels. See, if we're going to understand, we kind of understand that white space is good, but we don't really embrace it because most user interfaces you see today are designed by people taking a surface, dividing it into rectangular areas, and pouring something into every rectangle. Our user interface technologies have traditionally forced us into that mental model because windows are rectangular. But notice, we try to stay away from that here. We don't reserve a rectangle for the picture. It's small, it gets bigger when it's needed. The notes get bigger when they're needed. We hover to get more information. There's not a piece of the screen set aside for the extra information. And the reason that we've done left justified labels our whole life is because of that rectangular orientation we've had. Those labels help maintain that rectangular feel. Well, we don't have to use left justified labels. Right justified maintain the white space better, and people like it even though it tends to be at a subconscious level. To give you an idea of this principle in the real world and see how powerful it is, let's take a look at a couple of pictures. So, you ever go to Rodeo Drive, Park Avenue in New York, whatever, where they've got these very fancy shop windows with expensive things in them? Did you ever notice that they don't put a lot of things in their windows? Their windows tend to look like this. Now, if you saw this shop window versus this one, which one do you think is selling expensive, high-quality goods? And which one is selling cheap goods? You see, mentally, you didn't really make that decision on the basis of any logic. Your brain immediately said, oh, there's lots of interesting white open space. They must have very high-quality goods that's inviting me into the store to examine the quality in more detail. Whereas these people are saying, man, our stuff's cheap. You better see what you want in the window or there ain't no point coming in here. So those principles are present around us all the time, and they apply to our software. The intelligent use of space is a very valuable design principle for helping please our users. Now remember something, a basic principle. First of all, I know this is kind of uncomfortable. There's a couple of principles I want to mention. This stuff's kind of uncomfortable to some people, but back in the 80s, I formulated my first law of programming, which is users outnumber developers. We're supposed to do what's best for them. And secondly, maybe there's kind of a chain there, but eventually users determine whether or not the stuff we do is regarded as valuable. If we do stuff and nobody ever sees it, nobody ever knows it's any good, you can do the best server-based report something or other processing that you've ever seen. But if it is reflected in an ugly user interface, as far as the user is concerned, your work is ugly. It's an unconscious impression, and they can't help it. And the more they see good stuff, the more they see elegant, well-done designs, and the more they grow to expect them, the more your ugliness stands out. You could get away with it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe even now and for a little while longer. I don't know that you'll be able to get away with it forever, though. Sometimes you look at design principles and they're all kind of related to one another. I guess I should finish up a couple things because I was talking about the whole rectangular thing. I did want to show another couple of examples of that, the bad white space thing. This is a screen done by Microsoft Consulting Services in Great Britain for the National Health Service there. What does this screen say to you as soon as you see it? Busy. See, so you knew that. You knew that before you walked into here. And yet this was done by very, very talented people. But it's people that have lived and shaped their lives in the .NET ecosystem. They think complexity is fine. Now, there are some innovative, interesting things here. Some of the data visualization stuff is extremely well done. But when you look at the screen, users don't like it. It feels overwhelming to them. Why? Why do people care about space? Well, evolution helps us understand that one too. Go back in time. Put yourself in the brain of one of your 40,000-year-ago ancestors coming onto the savannah in Africa and living there. So you're on the savannah. There's 3 trees in a bush. And you're standing there looking around, sort of, strolling along. You can keep an eye on every one of those trees in that bush. No problem. Track them all. So what does that mean to you? What's the subconscious feeling you get when you've got lots of open space and 3 trees in a bush? Safety. You feel safe. It's completely unconscious, but you feel safe. Now let's suppose you walk in over a hill, and there's 57 trees and 14 bushes, and you've got to walk through all of them. Now what does that mean? It means a lion might jump out from behind any one of them, and now you no longer feel safe. People prefer openness. That is called the Savannah effect, and it's related to the concept of white space, the Savannah principle. There's also a related principle called the biophilia effect, which basically means people like things to feel natural. They like things to feel like they're part of the natural world. Well, so how does that impact? Well, as we'll see later, it impacts the way you do colors. Take a look at this screen. Did you notice the background? How many of you noticed when I demoed it that the sticky notes had a gradient on them and weren't just yellow? How many did not notice that? Generally, 70-80% of people don't notice. They don't notice that there's a gradient on the notes. They don't notice that there's a gradient on the background. What that gradient does is subconsciously make people feel the interface is natural. Because in the real world, you don't find monochrome. We've written user interfaces with monochrome all our lives, but in the real world, monochrome's not there. Maybe blue sky overhead on a clear day. That's about all you see. So when people see monochrome, subconsciously they think artificial. And when they see gradient, subconsciously they think natural. And the biophilia effect makes them prefer natural things. And they can't even tell you why. I mean, they look at interfaces like this, and they like it. But if you ask them why, they'll give you vague sort of things. It's easier on the eyes. What does that mean? See, as developers, We're real verbal folks, aren't we? Man, we think everything's got to have a logical explanation. We need to verbalize it all. And no, this is completely subconscious. You don't want to, and you don't even want to try to explain it to them. You don't want to be going, you like it because of the gradients. No, just the fact that they like it is fine. Because if you tell them, the magic goes away, and you don't look like such a wizard. So understanding the principles and applying them, but not telling them and trying to draw it out in our usual developer verbal way is a much, much better approach. I mentioned that our brain is kind of wired to like open spaces and natural feeling stuff. And we can kind of prove that one too. I got a couple of photos for that. I want to do 2 photos. Let's see, we've got, I want to show them each for a few seconds. You tell me which one makes you feel calmer, more relaxed. Okay? This one or this one? These are the sort of things that you'd like to be tuned into as you get into the design world. And then there are subtleties. I mean, I talked about gradients, but I didn't really go into something that I should mention. Where's the light part of the gradients in this picture? On the top. Why? In the real world, lighting typically comes from overhead. Have you ever seen a picture of somebody with the flashlight underneath their face? What do they look like? They're creepy. The brain is wired to think that's creepy. Top-down lighting feels natural. So when you design your gradients, understanding top-down lighting is a big deal. It's not that hard once you kind of understand that it's there and the reason for it. See, as developers, you have kind of a challenge going into this world because you'll probably work with designers. Even if you're working with designers, it helps to understand these principles. It helps to understand why they're doing the things that they do. You'll work better with them if you understand. Designers typically don't. They're real right-brained guys. They don't verbalize this kind of stuff very much. They tend not to do that. So, if they know top-down lighting's a good thing, but they can't necessarily tell you why that is. But now you understand. It's an evolutionary thing. Some of them probably know that, but a lot of them don't. They just know it's good. They tend to just do things on general principle. Another example of that thing that makes user interfaces feel more natural is animation. Remember the picture that gets bigger and shows the button? Did you notice that it doesn't just pop bigger? It grows. Why? Did you notice that our screens go back and forth with some visual signals? Why do we do that? Well, see, people have web browsers. They've used them a lot. What happens when you close a web browser screen? When it disappears off the desktop? That sucker's gone. So people may think, I go to another screen, that one goes away, it's gone. But if we add an animation that just kind of slides it out to the side, that's a subconscious cue to them. It's not gone. It's sitting out there in space, and we can bring it back. Because that's more like the way things behave in the real world. In the real, we didn't evolve in a world where things disappear here and reappear over there. I mean, suppose I'm, okay, let's get down here. Suppose I'm here, and in the blink of an eye, I'm here. Your brain is hardwired to feel stress from that, to set off alarm circuits. You can't help it. Animation, now, but if I just walk over there, I'm still scared. You're still scared? You ever seen the movie Heaven Can Wait? Just reminded me of that, where Warren Beatty, it's at one point, some woman talking about people being scared of him, and he says, "Lady, I don't scare anybody." And then his wife walks in the door and screams. I didn't know I scared people. I thought I was more like Yoda, kind of. Design principles. Explain them, I will. We start looking at putting some of this kind of thing together. One of the things you run across a lot is that you learn some technology, and if you don't really understand the design principles that make it useful, you don't even necessarily know where to use it. I did a video on colors and brushes and images for an online seminar. One of my buddies, Ward Bell, watched it. Now, Ward's deep into technology. He's really good at that. But he'll tell you, he appreciates the user interface stuff, but he's still learning there. And he sent me an email saying, "I watched the video, and I knew every technology piece you showed, but the end result, I would never have thought to do that, to use those pieces to get that." Let me kind of show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to do one Visual Studio thing in this whole session, because if I don't, they'll arrest me at the end of the session and escort me out of the building. So let's suppose that we're doing a typical application, and we've got, we've designed a little thing. It's just a little card view. It's got a picture of a student. It's got his name. It's got a couple of things. That's the sort of thing we would do today, and we wouldn't think much about it. We'd quit right there, and okay, what's wrong with that? That's not too bad. We at least got different font sizes on the text blocks, didn't we? Well, gosh, there's some things we can do if we kind of understand design principles that from a technology perspective aren't that hard. First of all, let's tell this thing here, this grid, to have a nice background that's gradient. All right. I've got to get to, they've made me do this very small resolution, so my Visual Studio is a little reluctant there. So, getting a gradient brush is easy. It's not very hard. We can make it kind of top down if we want to. We can flip the ends of the gradient. Let's get that out a little bit so I've got more room there. Do this like that, so we get top down. We don't want that top to be quite that light, do we? More like that. Okay, so we got a nice gradient there. That's pretty good. We could go to, we might like a light font on that dark gradient, so we can do that pretty easily. We just tell the thing we'd like to have a different foreground. Okay, so they all turn. That's good. Gosh, that picture's kind of sharp edge, that rectangle stuff. You just hate that, don't you? So why don't we fix that? Why don't we give this guy an opacity mask? That's like this. Put this up to here. What just fell off? I'm sorry? Oh, did it? It kind of threw me off too. There we go. Because I was sliding the wrong thing. So get a little delicate edge there on the picture. And now, we've got layering. We don't have to just put everything in rectangular blocks. We've got a composition model that knows how to, is this thing running? Or let's see if it's, we've got a composition model that allows us to just kind of put things wherever we want them, right? Which actually takes up a little less space. And we might want to actually, because the picture might be light, and to give it a little more 3D sort of thing, we might want to give it a little bit of a drop shadow effect. That's real. It's in Blend, that's a drag and drop operation. Unfortunately, Visual Studio is not there yet. So we got to do this. Okay, so that's that one, and then we'll do it for the other two. I think the Visual Studio Designer for WPF and Silverlight still needs some work. What do you think? Do the last one. Oop, did I miss it? It's that one I want. Okay, so now we've got kind of a nice effect there. You saw me do it in what? How long did it take me to do that? 2 minutes, even with the monitor falling off? Okay. So, which do you think your users will prefer? I mean, that even takes up less room. And, you know, if you're really worried about some of the not being able to see the picture, you could make it so that when you're over the picture, the text kind of fades out, gets translucent. Use of translucency is a good thing in one of your design palettes. So it's not just understanding the technology. Without design principles, you won't know how to use them. Can you tell that I hate PowerPoint? I wrote my own touch-based thing here because. Beg pardon? Oh. Are we up there? Yeah, there we go. Let's see where we're up to. Yeah. There. Yeah. Some of the other things about getting to natural, I just kind of recapitulate a few of the things you've seen so far. The gradients, the animations, 3D effects are good. And an interface feels more natural if it works with the way people's job flow works. It actually has a natural feel to it. If it forces them to go through all kinds of complicated things to accomplish actions, it emphasizes the fact that it's software making them behave instead of doing work for them. So one of the design principles to take into account from that is something called desire lines. Now, you've seen desire lines, even if you don't know them by that term. You ever been in an office complex or whatever that had a bunch of sidewalks laid out in rectangular patterns? And then the worn down paths through the grass where people really walk? That's desire lines. You should create your software with desire lines in it, where people want and need to go. How do you do that? Well, you meter it. You can do this with websites. You can do it with client-based software. You capture the things that users do. You capture the steps they go through, and then you analyze that. And that's what we're good at, right? That's supposed to be what we're good at, is analyzing and spotting trends in data. So we can figure out, gosh, they do this all the time, and it takes 8 steps, and these 3 are the same every time, and they're not adding any value. Let's rip those 3 out. Or put them off in an advanced thing that they don't get all the time. So understanding desire lines. And it just helps if you have terms to go with this. You're able to talk to your designers more effectively, and even to your users more effectively. And this is kind of a general principle that explains why this stuff should be so important to you. There's something called the aesthetic usability effect. They've got research for this. It says that users believe beautiful software is more beautiful, even if it is functionally identical to ugly software. Even if it has exactly the same features, pretty much laid out exactly the same way. Just the fact that you add attractiveness to it makes people give it a chance. They're inclined to feel better about it. Well, that's evolution again, isn't it? I mean, what happens when you meet somebody for the first time and you can barely stand to look at their face? You look for reasons not to associate with that person. You can't help it. Now, they may eventually win you over by having a wonderful personality. But how long does it take you to form the first impression? Seconds. 30 seconds is a long, long time. Most first impressions, most people's impressions of people are formed in 5 to 10 seconds. Why do you think it's any different for software? Beauty counts in this world. People's brains are wired for it. Look, there's a reason they don't put ugly people on magazine covers. They even enhance them to make them better before they put them on the cover, because people are attracted to beauty, and again, it operates pretty much at a subconscious level. So there are lots and lots of those design principles. I mentioned the book. Let me point out something about all of that, since I'm kind of getting down to some of my final stuff. And the design principles tend to be a group. This was when I went through the book that I showed you. I kind of went through design principles that were related to one another. Talk a little bit about this. The aesthetic usability effect, also an attractiveness bias. That's kind of a subtle difference. There's also the expectation effect. The fact that when things are beautiful, people expect it to work well. There are lots and lots of expectation effects. They've studied these. They found out that adding more teachers enhances, well, no, I guess the best study on this was, you ever heard the famous lighting study in the factory? Where they came in and said, well, we're going to study the effect of changing the lighting to see if that improves productivity. So we're going to brighten the lighting. And productivity went up. And later they came back and said, well, we're now going to check to see whether or not productivity is affected by lowering the lighting. And productivity went up. They weren't expecting that. Just the fact that people were being paid attention to gave them an expectation in a certain direction, and the result of that was measurable. So there are various kinds of expectation effects. The fact that people like big open spaces in building, the cathedral effect. All of those are kind of associated. There is the whole biophilia, the preference for naturalness. There are a whole lot of effects that kind of fit into there. Contour bias is one I haven't mentioned. The fact that people tend to prefer curved things instead of sharp things. And again, it goes kind of back to the real world. You wonder why these designers round off all those rectangles. People don't like sharp edges in general. So as you go through the book, I think it helps as for your purposes to kind of do this same exercise. Go through some of these principles and how they relate to one another. And then there's a whole bunch of them. You saw me there. I extracted some there. The Fitts Law, Hicks Law, and the 80-20 rule. And then there are some other principles that go along with that, such as progressive disclosure. You actually saw progressive disclosure demonstrated in staff links right here, where because we have templates and we can show people what we think they need to see the most, which includes name, phone number, email, and it turned out that for these folks, how many days since last activity was a key metric. Now, this is all very old data, so it doesn't really matter. But in production, less than 30 was good, more than 30 was bad. Probably means they're unavailable. But you hover, and now you get another set of information. What is this person's skills? What's their mailing address? We don't need that quite as often, but we do need it. What have we done with them lately? What have we paid to them, and what jobs have we given them? So those kinds of things are only shown when people need them. Progressive disclosure is much easier. With modern UI technologies, you show people most important things, another layer, and then they only have to go to the detail to get everything, access to everything. That promotes their productivity, and again, makes it feel natural and works with their flow. We are kind of hooked into this idea that we do, let's select this thing off a list, usually in a bloody data grid, and pick that record, and then just dump everything you possibly know about it. I tell people when I look at modern interfaces done in XAML, the most common thing I spot that tells me those people really haven't thought very much about design is that I look at their application and it's got like a dozen data grids in it. Data grids made sense in older technologies, kinda, sometimes. But we have lots and lots of alternatives now, and we find we use data grids far less often. It's not that they have no role, it's just that their role is significantly reduced. But developers who don't care about these things and don't really care about whether or not things are right for the user, data grids are a cheap and easy solution, aren't they? Dump them on the screen and just dump a bunch of columns in there and let the user figure it out. Well, they can slide the columns around to see the ones that are most important. If you're doing your job right, you ought to know what data is most important to them. But you have to have empathy to do that and understand how to present that data, and that means good principles. So progressive disclosure, hierarchy of needs, etc. So basically, it's good to kind of go through and understand all the different things, the principles and how they correspond. Some of them don't group naturally, but many of them do. So that's an exercise I recommend if you decide to go through that book. Inevitably, when I talk about this stuff, I get people going, that sounds good. But we're too busy. We do not have the time to do that kind of thing. We don't have the time to learn. We don't have time for all that touchy-feely stuff. Who's going to pay for it? I see this every time I do a session on prototyping. Some well-meaning person on Twitter lights up, I don't understand who's going to pay for this. Look, sure there are places where, if you've got 5 users, there is a limit to the amount you can invest in understanding their situation and making them more productive. Because making 5 users more productive doesn't have a big payback. But suppose you have 1,000. And suppose you make them 10% more productive. And let's make this clear. We've had systems where the throughput metrics showed improvement from good user interface design and workflow of 40 to 50%. 10% is modest if you do it right. But let's just suppose 10%. Let's be conservative. 1,000 people. Well, you just saved 100 full-time equivalents. What do people cost in today's economy? Loaded cost. Typical office environment. 60, 80,000? That's $6 to $8 million of impact every year, just from good design. So there are certainly places where it does apply. And you ought to be looking for that. You save a business $8 million a year, they will pay more attention to you. I also want to mention a little bit, this, as much as I love this book, as I mentioned before, we are in kind of a rapidly evolving world. So there are things that aren't in there. There are context-dependent design principles. So as you move into certain areas, you'll discover that there are design principles specific to that area. They aren't universal. That's why they're not in the book, because it's titled Universal Principles. So in Touch, for example, oops, let's get back to my other screen. In Touch, for example, it turns out that selection menus at the bottom make a ton of sense. That's why the iPad has them that way. Why? Why don't we put the normal menu of stuff over on the left? Because if they reach for it, they block part of the screen. If they reach for the bottom, they don't. Then there is something called Gorilla Arm. You ever seen an HP TouchSmart? The vertical monitors with touch? Very nice technology that didn't sell very well. Why not? Well, it turns out that for applications people use all the time, as opposed to kiosks or something, if you do this all the time, your arm gets tired in about 5 minutes. And it's just kind of, doesn't want to do anything. That's called Gorilla Arm. It's a physiological effect. So what that says is if you're going to do touch, you need to keep that thing down flat. People can just kind of keep their hand on it the way they do with a mouse. And then you have to understand the gestures. Do you know what a pinch is in touch? Some of you probably do, but I bet a lot of you don't. So you have to kind of know the lexicon for the special areas that you're in, and those are design principles. Some other things. Kevin, did you ever get here? No, I asked for something and I wasn't sure if he would make it in or not. They didn't bring in the box, did they? No. Okay, let me tell you what you can do. If you're going to get into the whole design space, one of the more useful things to do is to carry a notebook around with you as much as you can to sketch the things you find and the notes and ideas that you come up with. You don't have to do it forever. Typically, most people do it for 6 months to a year as they're kind of developing this, some for even less. But it's surprising people find how well that helps. If you want to design a notebook, go over to the Connect area of the exhibit floor and go to the regional director booth, and they'll give you one. They're free. Now, they've got some other stuff. They've got a lot of blank pages in there, all right, the usual sort of stuff. And they've also got some show guide stuff. Because I'm a member of a group of folks called the Regional Directors. Some of you may have heard of us. They're all whacked like me, which means if you want to know sessions from them, there's a couple of pages at the beginning, which after you leave Tech Ed, you can rip out and just use it as a design notebook. So if you want one, trot over there. If you ask nice, they might give you more than one, depending on what their supply looks like. So go get yourself a design notebook. Look for things in the real world. One of the more key things to stimulate this kind of thinking and creativity, besides reading the design books. Oh, I almost forgot another thing I wanted to mention. Some people find that one of the best things they can do to get more, give the right brain some exercise, is to learn to draw. And this book is my recommended path to that. If you can't sketch, if you think that you've never been able to sketch, you'd be surprised. I've had, I don't know, half a dozen people send me email or come up to me and say, this book just changed my whole view of myself. So you might want to give that a try. And then there is the multiple prototyping thing. We do this a lot because there's a tendency in our business to think of prototyping in terms of the prototype. We do one. At StaffLinks, we did 4. I can tell you that the first one didn't look anything like that. And the idea of multiple prototypes, especially with all of this new capability we have, is that you do first one that you think is kind of takes care of the job, maybe with some good ideas in it, but it's probably going to be kind of traditional, kind of ordinary. Then what you do is pretend you cannot use that one and set it aside. That the lawyers have said no, or the users don't like it, or something. What would you do if you couldn't do that one? And repeat that 2 or 3 times. Now you'll be pushed into some new territory for ideas. And as you do those prototypes, don't necessarily do them in Visual Studio. We typically don't. We do them in Photoshop, some other sketching tool, sometimes Blend, but we don't even like to go to Blend too early. See, if you do something in a drawing tool, you won't constrain your ideas based on what you know how to do with the technology. This is going to be true of HTML5 as well. You want to be open about how it should look and how it should act, and then later you can figure out how to make it do that. I can tell you this, in the XAML world, we have never prototyped something in Photoshop that we couldn't figure out a way to do in XAML. So do sketching and prototyping. That will open up your brain. Oops, that's about it. I have about 3 minutes for questions, I think, and there are microphones there. So any of you who have aching questions, I'll be happy to. I will go over to that regional director area and answer questions for as many of you as you want. But if you have important questions right now, please go to the microphone and I'll see what I can do. Yeah, up there.
You mentioned about if you have 1,000 users, it's easy to justify. But what if you really do have 2 users? How can you justify to management that you want to spend the time for adequate design?
Well, it depends on how important those users are. But let's face it, if it's 2 users and using something 2 or 3 hours a day, there might not be a cost justification. Design-oriented people often want to do it no matter what. And sometimes the economics don't work. I'm much more focused on when the stuff does work. Now, if you learn about design principles, in some of the things that you do, some of the benefit you get, gradients and things like that, it's no extra cost to do that. You saw me do that in 2 minutes. So some of the benefit you can get can be accessed without any additional investment. But there's other parts of it that maybe you can't justify in certain circumstances. Just the way it is. Anybody else up at a mic? All right. To finish off, I got some business cards here for those that like them. I teach classes in WPF and Silverlight, including design principles, along with the technology. So if you've got a team moving to that, you can give me a holler. I got a card up here for you now.